Hello, everybody. Welcome to I guess this is our second of our AKS community meetings. Good to have folks here if you're listening live or in the recording. The little countdown timer, the music at the beginning, it didn't seem like anyone really guessed what it was or knew what it was from. It's actually from a TV show I like. It's called It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And I'm allowed to use the music because when they created the show, it was originally a very low budget show, and they used just free music off of the internet. And so I decided perfect thing to use here. So thanks for being here. I'm going to put up our agenda and kind of walk through what we're going to cover. I'll do a quick reminder of kind of what is this community, what we're here to do, and just kind of some of the ways that you can stay in touch with things. We'll go over some recent announcements and so forth. But really, hopefully, keep that part pretty brief and get quickly to our special topic and our special guest speakers to talk about our work with Istio. And I'm super excited about the work that we've done there. So good to have everybody here. Let's go ahead and dig into it. What is this community? One of the things that we really wanted to do is have a place where our product team can connect to our customers. Hopefully bring you information, bring you content, demos, any kinds of sessions where we bring on some PMs and do ask me anything type sessions and so forth. We're using this YouTube live sort of technology here to hopefully give you opportunity to put some questions in the chat. Some other folks from the team are actually on there and can answer some questions for you. So hopefully we get that opportunity to make things interactive. So certainly if you have questions there, we'll be looking at those. We may answer them in the chat. We also can answer them in the live stream. And so we'll bring some questions up towards the end and pose them to the speakers and things like that. But in some cases, you'll see these content added to this YouTube channel that's not live. And so sometimes we'll just record some video demos. Certainly a good place to stay in touch with what's going on. In some cases, we'll invite in our partners. We'll invite in MVPs, folks from other Microsoft teams that regularly go out and talk about technology. So hopefully these will be fun or at least interesting to be able to hear what's going on with our AKS platform. These links will be in the video and on the channel and everything like that. But just stay in touch by going out to Twitter or X or whatever we're going to call it now. And you can get notified of when we're doing our next meeting and so forth. So recent announcements. Not a lot's happened in the last month, though. These couple items that are here are actually pretty awesome, and so I want to make sure that we highlight these for you. And I think these are both great topics for future community sessions like this. The application gateway for containers is something that I personally think we've needed for quite some time. Really, your options for bringing traffic from the outside into your clusters, it's fairly complex. There's a number of ways to do it. We've got some great architecture guidance on using App Gateway and putting it in front of load balancers and ingress controllers and so forth. But in a lot of cases, a lot of that effort was somewhat custom. Customers were piecing together a bunch of different technology. In some cases, they used the App Gateway ingress controller, which had some level of limitations. And so this is finally a Kubernetes native solution for bringing traffic into your environment, using things like the Gateway API as a part of the Kubernetes project and so forth. So again, these links will be in the video description, but there's obviously official docs. I want to highlight that blog post from Dennis Silke, one of our Microsoft colleagues out of Germany, wrote a really nice post on what this is used for, how to use it, and a little walkthrough of what to do. So definitely take a look at that. Similar kind of concept around storage. Storage is another one of those things that I think people avoided persistent workloads in Kubernetes because storage was often difficult. And so Azure Container Storage is there to address that kind of thing. You've got a set of operators running in your cluster, and you define storage objects, and they get provisioned and connected to your applications. It makes it super easy. I'm not saying you would necessarily build a completely full database engine on your own. It's probably better to take advantage of managed services. However, there's tons of other scenarios where storage is absolutely critical. And so our Azure Container Storage preview is something you want to take a look at. There were other announcements, honestly, in the last meeting we did, so feel free to go back and take a look at those. A lot of things we've announced in the last year are all pretty exciting, and we expect a lot more to come here in the next 6 months or so with things like KubeCon coming up in the fall, Ignite, and so forth. We tend to make a ton of announcements around those events, so looking forward to that. As far as our schedule, the schedule is a bit ad hoc. We're not necessarily only going to do this once a month. So you can see our next one here is only a couple of weeks from now. We've got one of our partners, an ISV that we work with called Portworx. Kind of fits nicely with the storage topic. So we're going to do that one on August 31st. And then some of the topics that I think are interesting as far as soon to be or soon into the future. And so those are ones that I'm thinking about, but again, always interested in having feedback around topics that folks want to hear about. So please let us know in the chat, on Twitter, any of those kinds of things, and we'll try to make sure we have all those kind of topics for you. Our main topic for the agenda today is Service Mesh and Istio and the add-on work that we've done in AKS. I am a big fan of service mesh technology. I've talked about this at events. I think one of the KubeCon in Austin, Texas, I forget what year it was, I did a demo using Istio in a CI/CD pipeline. And I've done a bunch of demos actually with Linkerd. As much as I really like Istio, I also am a big fan of Linkerd. And we offer all those kinds of options in AKS. Customers certainly bring their own kind of service mesh and use those technologies. But today we're here to talk about Istio. So I'm going to bring the team on here and we'll do quick introductions. So I'll start with you, Keith. It's nice to have you here. If you could just introduce yourself, maybe tell us a little bit about what you do, where you're from, anything like that, favorite movie, whatever is on your mind.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, Brian. Thanks for the invitation on. Hey, everyone. I'm Keith Maddox. I'm an engineering lead for Upstream Service Mesh here at Microsoft. I'm based in the Birmingham, Alabama area. Just to kind of help you geographically, that's about 2 hours west of Atlanta. And I spend a lot of my time working on various open source technologies in the networking and mesh space, such as Istio, obviously, but also Gateway API, Envoy, a little bit of everything. So it's great to be here and be able to talk about Istio with everybody.
Yeah, cool. Shashank, do you want to go next?
Hey everyone, I'm Shashank. I'm a senior PM on the AKS team. I focus specifically on the multi-cluster service mesh and the multi-tenancy, like identity-related areas. And I also work on a couple of things related to observability and the networking integrations that Brian just spoke of a little earlier, application gateway for containers. But today, the topic that we're speaking on, service mesh, is my primary area. Spend a lot of time there, and I'm also excited about the steps that we've taken recently and what's coming up in the near future. So looking forward to discuss that.
Okay, awesome. Well, I certainly have a ton of questions that I would ask at this point, but I'm going to hold off because I at least know some of the slides and demos and things like that Keith's going to bring here to kind of kick this off. So I'll wait with my questions till kind of after that part. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Keith, I'll add you to the screen here, and I'll probably duck away here while you're covering that and let you kind of talk for a bit. And then we'll certainly take questions in the chat. If we see anything interesting when you're kind of hit the point where you're done with your demo, we'll put some of those up on the screen and kind of go from there. So let me get this added. And you are all set. You can go ahead.
All right, appreciate it, Brian. So like I said, this is going to be focused on the Istio-based service mesh add-on for AKS. We're going to go through some high-level concepts around what a service mesh is, why you might need one, and then we've got a recorded demo for you in the middle. Once we get through all of that, and like Brian said earlier, please, anything that you see that you've got questions about the technology itself or how I've integrated it within Azure, please feel free to pop those in the comments and we'll try to get to them. And then at the end there, we're going to have Shashank talk to us about our roadmap and where we're going from here. So like I said, kind of one of the first questions that I think is important to answer when you're dealing with service mesh technology is why. Just like anything else in technology, you really want to make sure that you have a problem that you're solving before jumping to a solution. And the problem here is something pretty familiar to most people watching this right now. Cloud native microservices have unlocked a lot of resilience and flexibility for organizations. You're able to scale services independently, use multiple languages based on your need and your use case. And it's really harkened to a whole new level of productivity for these organizations. Product teams who used to depend on a ops team that was off in a corner somewhere can now own the end-to-end life cycle of just their own services. And this is a fantastic working arrangement for a lot of people. But what does this mean for the service owners themselves? Well, now they've got a lot of new responsibility that they are having to handle. And the network presents a layer of instability because it's now in between each one of the services. In the good old monolith days, if you're used to C# or Ruby on Rails monoliths, in the monolith days, you talk to a service that you have to pass some information to. That all happens in the runtime. And it's you have a pretty good idea that it's going to succeed. But there's no such thing as a perfectly 100% reliable network. And so that means that we've got to deal with this instability now. There's a layer of trust that we lose, and things get obfuscated. And now suddenly we've got service owners have these new concerns around traffic management and observability and making sure there's adequate security for all their service-to-service communication. And historically, organizations have solved this in one of two ways. The first is still pretty popular to this day, where you'll embed these logic into the service code itself. Organizations will implement this via fat client libraries that they either open source or develop in-house. And large companies such as Netflix even publish their own so that people can take advantage of it, and they've seen widespread adoption. Things like Hystrix or the .NET framework itself have a rich history and rich tool set to be able to handle just about any number of things that you could need in a distributed microservices world. The other option would be to deploy a binary alongside your application code that handles these concerns for you. No changes required for your service code, and this really gives you an accelerated on-ramp to microservices because your application developers don't have to change anything about their final binary. This latter approach is what we now call today service mesh, and it has a lot of benefits for us. Istio is one of the first service meshes that hopped onto the market, and the benefits are endless. You get secure service communication in a cluster with mutual TLS encryption, and it's not just encryption. You can use something like WireGuard or IPsec for encryption. But what it also provides you is a rich identity-based authentication and authorization mechanism for you to leverage throughout your entire organization. Because there are sidecars deployed in each service, you get fine-grained control of traffic behavior with routing rules, retries, failovers, and even fault injection. Remember chaos engineering for those of you who's been around for a little bit. Istio has a little bit of that chaos engineering goodness where you can routinely inject failures into your system to make sure that it handles them gracefully. I mentioned earlier that authorization and authentication scheme. The entirety of Istio is a pluggable policy layer where you can call out to external services for authorization. And you've got a configuration API that gives you access controls, rate limits, and quotas for various use cases. And the beauty is that when you deploy these things, you can observe all the things that are happening with metrics, traces, and logs, the big three pillars of observability. You can see them for all the traffic within your cluster, plain text and encrypted. And depending on the services and proxies you deploy as part of Istio, you can even get this for ingress and egress eventually. And great news, as of about a month ago, Istio is now a CNCF graduated project. And so within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Istio has gone through all the steps necessary in order to reach graduated status. And it's great to be a part of this honestly exclusive community with the likes of Kubernetes, Envoy, and to go back to something Brian said, Linkerd as well as a CNCF graduated project. And AKS, we want to bring all this goodness, all this functionality over to AKS. And so we're talking about the Istio-based service mesh add-on. There's a number of benefits from using the Istio add-on from AKS. You get the versions tested and verified to be compatible with all the supported versions of Azure Kubernetes Service. We will scale the Istio control plane for you as part of your managed offering, and we can even adjust certain configurations of common AKS components like core DNS to be able to handle the fact that you're running a service mesh in your cluster. We will manage the ingress, the internal and external ingress setup. So when you deploy an ingress gateway into your cluster, whether it's a publicly accessible one with a public IP or a private IP, we'll handle the provisioning and scaling of that for you. We verify that it will continue to work with Azure Monitor managed services for Prometheus and as well as Azure Managed Grafana. And of course, just like everything else, you get official Azure support provided for the add-on across upgrades and all the various features that we support. And so now what I want to do is I want to kind of show you a demo of all of this feature goodness that we've been talking about here. We're going to start from the very beginning, and we're going to play this video, and we're going to deploy an AKS cluster. And once we deploy the AKS cluster, we can see that there's a service mesh profile now added to that managed cluster profile. We haven't activated it yet, but we're going to take advantage of that in the next step. So I've gotten a couple of questions on if this works for existing clusters or not. It absolutely does. And that's where we're going to deploy the cluster first without Istio. And now it's time for us to add it on top. So first, we're going to take a look at our cluster name and resource group just to make sure we're targeting the cluster that we are intending to. And once you've done that, we're going to run this new command in the Azure CLI when you've got the preview mode enabled. It's called AZ AKS Mesh Enable. This is a first-class subcommand within the Azure CLI. And for those of you who are used to using these Azure tools, you're going to be able to use this in the same exact setup that you're used to. And so we're going to run this. And after a little bit of time, I sped this up a bit so that we don't have to wait so long. But we see it now deploy within the managed cluster profile. Next, we're going to get some credentials and dig in and verify that the components have been deployed the way that we expect. So we're going to add it to our kube config. That's going to enable us to do kubectl git pods. And we're going to look at it and we're going to see, okay, we've got this new AKS Istio system namespace and the Istio D pods deployed within that new AKS Istio system namespace. Istio D, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the control plane for the Istio service mesh. It's kind of the brain that knows how to program all the different sidecar proxies. And we deploy that into a special namespace, AKS Istio system, so that you know that everything within that namespace is sort of managed by Azure. That version there, ASM 1.17, corresponds to the revision of Istio. And because it's 1.17, that corresponds to the Istio 1.17 minor version. So now that we've got the mesh deployed, we're going to that's the same slot. We're going to advance now, and we're going to start deploying applications. Here we go. Got to hit the right button there. And so the demo that we're doing is called the book info demo. It comes embedded within the Istio code base. And what you see here is probably representative of a common microservice deployment at an organization today. So what's happening is that you've got a request coming into the cluster, and it's going to hit this product page written in Python. And from there, that product page is going to make various service-to-service calls in order to retrieve the information that it needs to render a response to the user. And so it's going to hit this reviews Java application that has 3 versions that are deployed. Reviews v1, reviews v2, and reviews v3. Product page is also going to hit this Ruby service called the details page in order to get information about the details for all the products. And then that reviews page is going to call the ratings Node.js service in order to get all the various information. And the advantage of using Istio, one of the big value adds, is that every communication that product page makes within the cluster is now going to be mutually encrypted mutual TLS, as well as authenticated to where you know that you know who you're talking to. And so we're going to see this demo done here in this next part of the video. So now we're going to pick it where we left off, and we're going to label the default namespace with istio.io /revision. And like I mentioned before, the revision is, you can think about it as the version of Istio that you're running. And we prefix it with ASM. And so the revision is ASM-1-17. And what labeling this namespace does is that it tells the Istio control plane, hey, I want to inject sidecars in this namespace. And sidecar injection is where the real magic happens, right? Once there is an application injected to the sidecar, it's able to take advantage of all these awesome features that we've been talking about. We're going to label the default namespace with that label so that it gets sidecar injected. And then we're going to apply the book info demo that I just showed you on the previous slide straight from GitHub. Like I said, it's embedded within the Istio repo. And so it's going to go and create all these various things, going to create service resources, service accounts, the deployments themselves. And we're going to wait for a little bit and make sure those all come up and are ready. So we're going to do kubectl get pod and the default namespace. And we see that there's actually 2 containers now injected in these pods. Without sidecar injection, I mean, my laptop is charging, I promise. Without sidecar injection, there will only be 1 container within these pods. And now, because you've got that Envoy sidecar injected, we see 2. And so this is another way to make sure that the Istio mesh is actually adding the sidecar like we expect, is you can check the ready column when you do a kubectl get. So the pods are ready. And like I mentioned, we see the 2 out of 2 for all the different pods and services we deploy. And so we're ready to start exposing traffic somehow. And so we're going to use another AZ AKS mesh command. And instead of enable, we're going to do AZ AKS mesh enable ingress gateway. And so we've built in a way for you to be able to deploy an Istio ingress gateway right here from the Azure CLI. We pass in our resource group and cluster name as we expect, but we also pass in an ingress gateway type. And we support 2 different ingress gateway types, internal and external. The internal ingress gateway type is only going to be accessible within your VNet. It's going to have a private IP and is going to be inaccessible from the public internet. But if you use external ingress gateway type, it's going to be accessible to the public internet. So for the purposes of this demo, we're going to use external just so it's easy to hit. But just want to be security conscious and say if you're going to make something publicly accessible, want to make sure you're using a TLS certificate and even lock down your cluster with some firewall rules. But for demo purposes, we're good to roll with external. That's going to run for a bit. We're going to spit out this managed cluster profile. We can scroll up and we can see that the ingress gateway component is enabled within the service mesh profile, and the mode is external. So we've verified that it's there from the Azure ARM perspective. And then we look at the AKS Istio ingress namespace. We can see a service deployed that's fronting the pods for the ingress gateway. And that service has an external IP that we're going to save for now and utilize in just a little bit to access these services. And so now we need to actually program the ingress gateways that we just deployed. Istio has a couple of special resources that you use to program ingress gateways. There are 2 of them we're going to take a look at. One is called Gateway, and one is called Virtual Service. And Virtual Service is kind of the meat of what you think about when you think about gateway routing. So we're going to look at the YAML file that was generated, and we see that the Virtual Service has a gateway spec field, and we bind to a particular gateway that was just deployed. And in this case, it's book info gateway external. We look at the gateway resource that it's referencing in just a little bit, but we see that the host is specified with a wildcard. Now, in production, you're probably going to want to limit which hosts are accessible via a particular gateway. But again, for a demo, you don't care too much about that. And we're going to scroll down and see that we've got HTTP matches for the traffic that's coming in. We've declared that the protocol essentially is going to be HTTP. And when the gateway detects HTTP traffic, we're going to follow these routing rules to route that traffic appropriately. So for example, when we see the URI go to /product page, we're going to go make sure you go to product page. If the URI has this prefix and some other exact matches, we're going to then go to the route that we define. The destination set to product page on port 9080. And that product page host is using the kind of the short name of the servers within the cluster, and Istio knows how to route that appropriately. So that's a virtual service resource that takes care of the actual routing rules for the cluster. And now we're going to look at the gateway. Now I want you to pay special attention to the kind, or the API version up at the top. Notice it says networking istio.io. This is not a gateway API gateway, if you're familiar with that. This gateway within Istio predates the gateway API, and there's some unfortunate naming collision here. But one way to disambiguate the two is to check the API version. And so we know this is in networking istio.io. And so it's going to serve a different purpose than the gateway API gateways. The purpose of the Istio gateway is to, first of all, select which which pods that it's going to be programming. And you see that with the selector, with the Istio label pointing to AKS Istio Ingress Gateway External. And then from there, we're going to kind of program some virtual servers. We only have one server defined here, and the host, again, is a wildcard. And we're going to say that this Ingress Gateway is listening on port 80 with an HTTP protocol. So this tells the Istio Ingress Gateway that's being fronted by that service with the publicly accessible external IP that it should listen to traffic on port 80 and expect HTTP protocol for that traffic. And so now that we've checked to make sure that the selector is appropriate and that the port and protocol match what we expect, it's time for us to actually try to make some calls. And so we're going to save all the data to environment variables, climb through, find the appropriate service IP and the appropriate port, and then we're going to echo out this gateway URL external URL / product page to make sure that it looks right and we see an appropriate IP address and port with the path that we expect. So we're ready to actually make a curl against this path. And so we do. And we expect to see valid HTML returned, and we do. The simple bookstore app HTML, that means that you've got a successful 200 response code, and the bookstore app is up and running. So up until this point, we've been able to, one, deploy the new Istio add-on for AKS onto an existing AKS cluster. We verified that the installation was successful by checking for the presence of Istio control plane within the AKS Istio system namespace. We've labeled the default namespace with a revision of ASM 1-17 to signal that you want sidecar injection there. We've deployed our book info demo and seen that the sidecar injection was successful. And then we've deployed an Ingress Gateway that's externally accessible with a public IP and sent traffic to it, and watch those service calls be made successfully. And that's evidenced by the HTML response here. And those calls are all MTLS encrypted. So that's a lot of really awesome features that we got relatively quickly. But what I think is really cool is what we've done here at Azure to make the Istio experience Azure native. And so we actually already have support for using the Istio Service Mesh add-on with Azure Monitor and Azure Managed Grafana. We're going to demo that for you here in a second using the Managed Prometheus and then Managed Grafana. So we're going to go to the next slide and look at this next part of the demo. So we are picking up, is this the right slide? Right, no, it's not the next slide in advance. Okay, there we go. So we're going to pick up from where we left off, and we're going to enable Azure Monitor metrics within our test cluster. This is the first step. This is, at the time of recording, was still in preview. I'm not sure what the status of it now, but if it is in preview, then you're going to have to make sure, again, that you've got your Azure CLI registered with the preview version. And so we're going to enable our cluster to use Azure Monitor. And that's going to take a little bit. And once that's done, we've got to write some configuration to tell Prometheus how to scrape the metrics that we want it to scrape. And so we hope to get rid of the step in the future. But for now, you need to write this relabel config into your cluster. So we're going to write a small local file, and then we're going to run kubectl config map create, or kubectl create config maps, sorry. And we're going to call the name AMA metric scraper. Whoops, we went a little too far. We're going to just rewind that a bit and make sure folks can see. There we go. So yes, so notice that the name of this config map is AMA metrics Prometheus config. It is a special name that the agent within your Kubernetes cluster, your AKS cluster, knows to look for. And because you put it in the kubesystem namespace, it's going to automatically be applied. And the config is going to be picked up by the agent, and it's going to start scraping the configuration appropriately. Now, once you create this configuration file, this config map in Kubernetes, the scraping is already going to happen. But you have to give yourself some IAM permission to Azure Monitor, if you haven't already, to make sure you're able to read the metrics that have been scraped. So that's what we're going to demonstrate now, adding a role assignment, and we're going to give ourselves the role of monitoring data reader. And this just enables you to access the data in the Azure Monitor workspace. So I'm going to go through, add myself to this role assignment, give myself this role assignment. And then once I find myself here in the pane, I'm going to review and create, and then let it create. So now I'm waiting for a little bit while that role assignment gets added. And now we're done. After a little bit of time, it's added. So we can go into the Azure Monitor workspace within my resource group and pick a time range and write some PromQL queries. One of the most famous common Istio metrics is Istio request total, that tell you the total number of requests that came within your Istio mesh. And so, excuse me, once we run that PromQL query, we're able to see within the Azure Monitor graph the number of requests that have been coming to our cluster right here within Azure Monitor. So again, by working tightly with the AKS team and upstream, we'll be able to create this first-class experience within Azure, bringing the power of Istio into Azure Monitor. But we're not done. Maybe you prefer Grafana as your visualization tool of choice. We've got you covered. So we're going to create a new resource group, and we're going to run the AZ Grafana create command within that resource group to create an instance of Azure Managed Grafana. And so we're going to wait for that to run for a little bit. And once that completes, we're going to be ready to open up our Grafana dashboard, our Grafana instance. To give us a URL, we can just go in and access it because we're authenticated with Azure. And within Grafana, you're able to set up different kinds of data sources. And so the data source that we're going to be utilizing today is, of course, Prometheus, because we just saw the managed Prometheus within Azure Monitor just a second ago. And we can add Prometheus here, but we notice that we're going to have to authenticate. So we got to go back to the Azure portal and give the managed Grafana instance permissions to be able to read the data from the Azure Monitor workspace as well. So we're going to go in, add our resource group, and give it the appropriate role. That role is going to be monitoring data reader once again. And you're just going to wait for a little bit for that role to be added. And now that the role has been added, we're going to just wait for eventual consistency to do its thing, refresh a couple of times, but eventually we're going to see that the role appears here in the list. And so now that the role has appeared, we're able to go back into Managed Grafana and put the name it appropriately, and then we're going to put the URL here in HTTP, and we're going to choose Azure as our authentication mechanism. And we're ready to save. We Grafana tested it, and we know that metrics are flowing into Grafana. And so similar to our Azure Monitor example, we can go into Grafana, find the Istio request total metric. Just gonna type that in for now as the cache populates. But once you run that, we put that metric here in the dashboard, go up and run that query, and it's gonna make the request over to Managed Prometheus, and we see data being populated. So again, regardless if it's Azure Monitor or Grafana, we've got you covered when it comes to visualization tools for the Istio service mesh. That's not all. So Istio Upstream provides Grafana templates, essentially like package and dashboards for you to put your data sources at and visualize your Istio service mesh. We're going to use those dashboards today. You see the power of Azure and upstream open source communities coming together and making magic happen for you. So we're going to go to Grafana and search Istio, and we find the URL for our dashboard. And we're going to go here, import that dashboard by pasting the URL of that Grafana, of the Grafana link that we saw before. So once you've pasted that URL, we're going to let it load. It found the right name. We're going to just give it a Prometheus data source. We've got one ready from the last slide. Azure Managed Prometheus is what we called it. And you're going to import it. And so now you've got a little bit, one error here, but by and large, we're going to go back to the past 3 hours, and we're going to change some things around for a workload that's been more, had more traffic to it, like Reviews V1. And we're going to, maybe Reviews V1 doesn't have a lot of traffic. We're going to go to product page. And product page, we're going to see, the incoming success rate of requests. And then we scroll down, and that's where the real magic happens, where we can get the responses broken out by response code, the success rate of 9.5x responses, the size. We can look at the response duration. And an interesting thing I want to point out here is if you look on the right here where my mouse is, where it's talking about the AKS Istio Ingress Gateway External and the AKS Istio AKS Istio Ingress. Whew, that's a lot of syllables. In that namespace, notice the log that's there. It's telling you that requests coming from that source are done via MTLS. And so that gives you the confidence to go to your security team and to know that all of your traffic from the gateway to service traffic is being secured via mutual TLS. And whoops, went to the past slide. We're just going to skip forward back to where we were and let it run through. This interface is not liking me. There we go. It does not want to start. And then we're going to, what in the world? Sorry about that. We're having some technical difficulties with PowerPoint. I'm just going to scroll all the way through here. Brian, you still there? I might have to restart the sharing because I just got this white screen.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. That's all the fun of doing it live. But one of the things that you were showing, kind of integrating with Prometheus and Grafana, I think that's one of the coolest things that we're doing here. Like if you just go grab Istio and experiment, you get a beautiful Grafana dashboard just kind of with the quick demo. The thing is, it's usually right in the cluster. It's not like it's installed Prometheus in the way that a large organization would run Prometheus. There's just a little instance running in your cluster. And so wiring Istio up with our real deployments of Prometheus and Grafana, I think that's a tedious task for customers. And what we've done is we have these managed Prometheus and Grafana solutions. They're real easy to wire those up to your cluster. And the same is true with this Istio add-on. That was one of the things to me that stands out, and why would I use this add-on maybe as opposed to just kind of doing it myself. That connecting all that together, I think, is super powerful.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. And I think I've got it back in a working state. So yeah, there we go. All right,
go for it.
And so yeah, we see a bunch of different rich dashboards that you get essentially for free. So again, this is the power of open source Istio coming here to Azure in order to accelerate your organization's microservice adoption. And we're not done yet. We're not done yet. And so I want to call on Shashank here to come and talk to us about our roadmap and the exciting things that we've got planned for the future.
Yep. Hey Keith, thanks for the presentation about what we have, even the integration with Azure Managed Prometheus, Grafana, all of them. So about the roadmap. So what we have right now, like even before the roadmap, is the public preview of the add-on, which we introduced around the KubeCon timeframe, like in April this year. What we're working towards right now is the general availability of the add-on. And as part of that, there are a couple of things that we are including in the GA scope. Like one, we're working on the upgrade experiences for Istio add-on. Right now for patch versions, we roll them out automatically as part of the AKS weekly updates. But for minor versions, we're planning to introduce an API wherein you can initiate a canary upgrade for the Istio control plane and then roll over the data plane like part by part. And this upgrade experience, we are tentatively targeting like around September mid for the initial preview of that one, and then eventually the GA of the Istio add-on along with the upgrade experiences. We're tentatively targeting October for that. And other things which are a part of the GA scope, we are also looking at bring your own certificate authority. Right now, the Istio add-on, when you install it, you only install it with the self-signed certificate authority. We want to provide the customer an option to bring their own certificate authority in terms of the intermediate certificate authority, intermediate key, the certificate object chain, and so on. Store them in a Azure keyboard and then reference them in the service mesh profile. So that's currently in work. Again, the same timeline, public preview sometime around September, and then like GA around the October, tentatively around the October timeframe. That's what we're looking at. Another one along the same timeline is the support for egress. Right now we have support for ingress, external and internal in the service mesh add-on. We are adding the option for egress as well. The same timeline as I mentioned for upgrade and for bring your own certificate authority. Bit more future looking now in like for the future. We like long term we want to like work towards a hosted and a managed service mesh where we host the Istio daemon control plane, and we also take care of the management part of it, and we provide auto upgrade and release channels capability for it. And this tentatively we're looking at sometime in 2024, like first half, towards the end of the first half, like maybe for a preview, and that's what we are like targeting for the host and managed service mesh. A related point there is ambient. So as Keith was mentioning, Istio upstream has taken a major bet on ambient, and it brings with it a different deployment model in terms of how the data plane is dealt with, in terms of how it relies on Z-tunnels and waypoint proxies instead of sidecars. And we see that not only as like a change in the Istio deployment model, but also as an opportunity for us eventually to see if we can simplify the managed part of the experience, because the sidecars not being there means that the upgrade experiences, for example, with respect to Istio, can be potentially streamlined. So right now, ambient is in alpha state upstream, and we don't know like if we can take it into the product like yet because of its alpha status and like its constantly evolving status. But we're waiting for ambient to go beta, not just waiting. Keith and his like upstream team like are working on helping like ambient get to the beta state, and then also once we have a beta, potentially we can like incorporate that into a preview. Once we have a stable version of ambient, we can incorporate that potentially into a GA product eventually. So that's the current thinking, and we see that as kind of like an important thing to consider, at least for the host and the managed service mesh. Next, we have mesh configuration flexibility. This is something that we are already actively working on in terms of being able to open up mesh config, in terms of being able to like author envoy filters and telemetry API, telemetry customer resources, for example, which we have kind of blocked today. We see that as providing configurability on those is like important, but at the same time, we want to be cognizant of what we open up versus not. So the approach we're taking there is we have started off with an extremely minimal surface area where we don't allow all of it, and instead we are taking customer feedback. We are happy to take feedback from all of you. Just go to the AKS GitHub repo, create an issue saying, hey, these are the exact envoy filters and telemetry customers that we want, and like here is a specific configuration that we want you to open up. And we are doing that over a customer calls too. And the more and more such like validation and feedback we get, we're able to finalize what configuration we want to support versus not support, what we open up versus not open up, and then we can roll those changes out. That's the approach we're taking with configuration flexibility. Next, we have FIPS compliant builds. So this is along the security like vertical. Like Istio has FIPS compliant builds, but yeah, we need to incorporate into our product. And also, again, in terms of requirements, folks, like feel free to reach out to us on AKS GitHub issues. We want to know more details about whether it's 141, 142, 143. What are your level of requirements? Why? What timeline you're looking for? Let's have a discussion around that, and we're happy to work with you on this. Next, we have Azure portal experiences for mesh, and this is also related to the SL authoring and error budgeting and alerting. So right now we started off with mesh experience in the CLI and the API, but we are actively working on portal experiences where you get a tabular view of the services, their matrices, you can author like SLOs, error budgeting, alerting, and then like we want to like basically like provide that like culture wherein you're like thinking about the service first, and in terms of what you want to achieve out of that service in terms of the objectives, and then work back to service mesh being like enabler to achieve that, which is the main reason for why we are like focusing on these portal experiences, the visualizations, the SL authoring, like integrations and so on. So that's the Uber level vision that we're going for that. On a related note, Grafana right now, as Keith was mentioning, we already support like the Prometheus and the Grafana like integration. You can self-install Azure Managed Prometheus like and the Grafana related add-ons once they're all hooked up. Like, and you can go to this Grafana dashboard, import a couple of the Istio mesh dashboards there, and hook it up with the PromQL queries. But having said that, as I just mentioned, it does require a few extra steps manually today. So we are working on smoothing that experience so that like if a cluster is enabled with an Istio add-on, and if we detect that, we automatically like provision a few dashboards in the like Grafana like workspace, like if we also know that you have it linked to the cluster. So those kind of like automatic integrations or something, like automatic like optional visualizations or something that we are working on. And the last one goes back to the first ever point that that Brian mentioned earlier in the call today, which is on integration with Azure Managed L7LB. That Azure Managed L7LB is the application gateway for containers. It's out there in public preview for single cluster today in terms of an individual AKS add-on standalone. But with mesh, for us to get it to working, we also need to focus on that MTLS handshake between the application gateway for containers and the meshed pods, for which there is some additional work required. Again, this is something we definitely know we are going to do. It's just a matter of when rather than if. And if this is a pressing need for you, and if this is something that's high on priority for you, feel free to reach out to us again on AKS GitHub like repo, and we are happy to triage that and have a discussion about, hey, this is maybe like a much bigger priority than we initially thought it out to be. So let's maybe prioritize this. That kind of adjustment in our priorities and like work is something we are always like open to do. So just feel free to reach out, not only about the Azure Managed S1LB issue, but overall about anything in the roadmap. Happy to discuss that and happy to like work with you on where we see our product going over the next couple of months to a year. Yeah.
Awesome. We definitely want to do some questions. I see there's actually a couple questions coming by in the chat. I think you answered the question about Kiali. That I guess things like that in general. There's customers perhaps using Istio today, and they want to come over to this add-on. Can they bring things like that with them, or how do they use things like that maybe aren't necessarily part of the default Istio install?
Yeah, I can take that. So in general, anything that works with open source Istio should work with our add-on, same underlying technology. We're our containers come from Microsoft Container Registry and have all the supply chain security stuff on top of it, but it's still the underlying source code. With Kiali specifically, I think that there might be one open issue around telling Kiali to read the AKS Istio system namespace instead of the Istio system namespace. But I think there may have been an issue created for that. I'll double check and get back to you folks after the live stream. But as long as your Istio integration tool, whether that's Kiali or whatever else, can talk to the AKS Istio system namespace, you should be good to go.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously those there was a question here in the chat about kind of like people like still holding back from going kind of towards the service mesh, which is sort of funny because when Kubernetes was first out, people were installing Istio in clusters, and like, why are you using Istio? And honestly, people would be like, I don't even know. It looked like the thing to do. That's definitely not a good reason, but I do think there's a lot of good reasons. Do you have experience just kind of talking to customers and what their hesitation is? I know this add-on helps with one of the hesitations, which is just kind of managing the control plane for it. But what else have you heard? Either of you heard from customers kind of holding them back, and what we can do to help with that?
I can take this one. Even before the customers, I'll give you a story of like how I got into this space. So I was in the Azure pipeline space. I was working more on the pipeline, like agents and all of that. And then started like playing with Kubernetes. And this was back around in 2017, 2018. And the first ever day, like I was working on Kubernetes, I installed Istio and all of these things. And it's been 5 years since I've been working in this area. And to be really, really honest, that one day, and like whatever I explored that day got me interested in this space. And it's not for the just for the tooling and the sake of like working on the tooling, but working back from the customer value in terms of like, hey, if I were to like run my own startup, like why would this matter for me? Look, I would care about services. I would care about like having SLAs for the customer facing part, but internally having SLOs and how I track against those SLOs and so on. And if, let's be honest, like if you're having service to service communication, like if someone's like not looking into availability, latency, error rates, these kind of things, I'll be really, really, really surprised. And if we are looking into that, and if we don't want to have like a ton of client-side application logic and just rely on like a battle-tested set of tools to help us facilitate that, whereas we can actually focus on application logic, sign me up for it. That was how I felt back then, and that's how what I hear a lot from the customers that we talk to as well.
100%. And I'll piggyback on that and mention a talk that I've given a couple of times called "To Mesh or Not to Mesh." And the premise of that talk is that a service mesh is not for everybody at every time. And what I mean by that is, if you are a startup and you're a startup of 10 engineers, right, and you've got one Kubernetes cluster, maybe writing the client-side logic is simpler for you because you've got a bunch of founding level engineers who can just code that out really quickly, and it makes sense for you. Maybe you're only writing in one language, and the overhead of that is a lot less than the overhead of understanding network technology. That might make sense for you. But when you get to a point in your evolution and your company grows, and now suddenly you do have distinct product teams owning a set of services, and those product teams are like half pagers, and your organization looks distributed in the same way that your systems do, that's when I start recommending people to take a look at service mesh. Because at that point, you're not just talking about a technological value add. It's not just software that you're adding into your system. You're actually allowing the software to mimic the way your organization works. And there's this thing called Conway's Law. It talks about the relationship between organizations and software. And that balance for when your organization and software are in harmony, that's where service mesh can do the most good.
And I would say too, I think in some cases it looks complicated, and some of the aspects of some of this, traffic splitting and some of that kind of thing, they are complicated. But in a lot of cases, companies just want MTLS and a quick dashboard that lets me go truly look in and see latencies down to individual pods and all of that kind of information. And that you get for so minimal effort, and configuration for those kinds of things is almost zero. So pretty powerful. Question in the chat here, I'm going to put up because I like this question. What about Dapper? Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a fun one. So just for those who aren't familiar, Dapper and Istio are both sidecar-based redirection tools, where Dapper focuses mostly on cloud APIs and reaching cloud APIs through basically a local interface. And Istio, as we've just talked about, is a service mesh that does traffic routing and things like that. In theory, there is no reason why those two tools can't work together in harmony. However, because of the fact that both of them are doing some traffic redirection, you'd have to take care to make sure that they don't overlap. I personally have not done that test. I know that theoretically it should be possible, but just haven't had the pleasure of looking into that specifically. If that's a use case for people, if people are really wanting to use Dapper and Istio together, reach out to me, reach out to Shashank, create an issue on the Azure/AKS GitHub repo, and let us know, and we can prioritize and take a look at it if that's something a lot of your customers are needing.
Yeah, it's a little bit scenario dependent. I've set it up without Istio, a different service mesh, and some things work, some things didn't. There's actually some pretty good Dapper articles that explain kind of how to do it, but some things won't work, and some things kind of go a little hairy. But I could see scenarios where you might want to use both. Maybe I'm using Istio for MTLS, observability, but I want Dapper to help me with some of those kind of connections to underlying services and being able to abstract away what I'm connecting to and working with. So great question. Appreciate that. And I know we're almost at time, so certainly would like to answer any kind of other questions. Feel free to continue kind of in the chat. But I first of all want to say thank you to Keith and Shashank. Appreciate you coming on here and talking about the great work that we're doing with Istio and AKS. And so I'll let you folks go, but I appreciate you joining here, and thank you for doing such a good job. Cool. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I feel like this is the part that nobody's going to be listening to. Everybody kind of will end the video. If you happen to still be listening at this point, please put something in the comment and say, I listened all the way to the end. Certainly, this is where you can go find us on Twitter, the AKS Community. That's generally at this point where I'm going to be putting any kind of updates and future kind of sessions that we have here. So again, thank you for everybody for joining. Enjoy the rest of the day and look forward to seeing you on the next one.